Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for inviting me and for Janet for her technical assistance tonight. I'm looking forward to speaking with wild ones always, and especially today, the first day of spring. And wild ones are always aware of a lot of the things that I will be talking about. What I'm hoping tonight, besides sharing kind of the gardening side with you, as I've learned a lot about it in my work at the UW Arboretum. Um, I hope that you can take away too some of these ideas at the level of the ambassador work that you all do for native plants in the community. So maybe not just strictly the gardening side, but also that other side as well is so, so important. And Wild Ones is like a key player in this work. So let's go ahead with the slides here. So I want to go over at first just a brief overview of native plant gardens and landscapes, kind of what I think about when I think about these terms and what value they have, what are some of the features they have. And this is kind of a good, I like to think of this as a good overview for a lot of the things that we get into more detail with either tonight in this talk or in our own work with our communities and our neighbors and in our own gardens. So I like to think of native plant gardens and landscapes as being examples of healthy and diverse places. So by healthy, I'm using health in the sense of Leopold's land ethic, but also, he included the plants, the animals, the um, soils, the waters, and air, all of the features of the biotic and abiotic system. So health to us, we might wonder, well, how do we measure that? How do we, how would we evaluate it? And I'm using it in a kind of a general way. We know we can think of it as healthy and not as healthy in kind of contrast. So we can think about some environments as having more elements in those different categories, more functional function in those categories, and that would be a good way to think about it. Um, Diverse means just what it says. So that means that we have a diversity of plants, diversity of animals, soil microbes, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we might not be measuring all of those things like, uh, bit piece by piece, but as we take care of these landscapes and gardens and we think more about them, we might come to learn more about those interconnections. And the health and the diversity are not unrelated either. So this is just an example in the picture of one of our gardens at the Arboretum. And you can see that quite a bit of variation in the plant forms, the flowers. Of course, that's just a point in time, kind of a mid-summer point in time. And there's also a tree there, which reminds us that we have, the different parts of communities represented even in small spaces like our own gardens. These gardens are full of life. And by that, I mean, you can pretty much tell, and many of you are totally familiar with this phenomenon. You put in a native plant bed or a native plant garden or a small restoration area, or you visit one, and you contrast it with, say, a lawn or a more traditional garden that perhaps is less diverse and maybe not maintained as diverse a set of plants as the garden that, the native garden that you're looking at, and it'll be full of life. It doesn't take long at all for animals, insects, snakes, I mean, everything you can think of to be in that space with you. It buzzes with, sound, it's got movement, it's got color. And these gardens are sustainable for the most part. We're working with native perennials. So some of them are short-lived, some are long-lived. The short-lived ones are usually really readily seeding themselves, maybe perhaps more so than a long-lived perennial, which may spread rhizomatously, even if slowly. So we have different life histories of the plants, but overall, the general picture is one of sustainable and continuing, although changing, composition and structure. They're maintained with low inputs. And what I mean by this is some of the things that Lisa mentioned there. We don't mow them during the season, obviously. We don't use fertilizers. That tends to disadvantage native plants, to be honest. We don't use insecticides or pesticides, except in very rare cases of a difficult, perhaps a difficult perennial weed that gets started and where we've been unable to control it any longer by hand weeding, we would possibly spot treat that, but that's pretty rare. And then we don't have to water supplementally in most cases. Perhaps at establishment, if you're putting in a new garden and then you get a drought right away, there may be some sprinklering involved in that just to get the plants established. But in general, we don't water them. The plant, even if there is a drought, the plants are generally resilient to that. They may go into dormancy early if it's a very severe drought, but then the next season they are back without any ill effect. So that's what I mean by maintained with low inputs. These gardens are of a place. And so I have the garden here at the Arboretum, and it's designed, was designed by Daryl Morrison to represent the native plant communities of southern Wisconsin. So we have the different prairie gardens, savanna gardens, woodland gardens, et cetera, that are appropriate for our part of the state. And when we look at that garden, we can see, if we know our vegetation a bit, we can see where we are. It shows where we are. If not the exact address, it shows us the ecoregion where we are. And there's probably, there's a lot of overlap with northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, of course. So we might locate ourselves in the same area should we see a native plant garden either in the Rock River Valley or up here in Madison. These plants are adapted to the soil and climate of the place where they have evolved for the places where they have evolved for millennia. And that doesn't mean that they are locked in to only a narrow range of climate and soils. There are, of course, plants suited for all different types of soils, different climatic, local climatic differences. And I'll talk about some of those later, just in terms of how they relate to the areas around our own homes. So they do have adaptation to the climate and soils, but they also do have resilience to variation in that, particularly in the climate. They're always changing, and this is, of course, true from day to day or week to week during the season, of course, but they're also changing over time. So one of the biggest changes that I've seen, of course, in the native plant garden, because we started with all young trees. And so about 25 years ago, all the trees were really 6 feet tall or less and tiny, not casting any shade at all. And now they're all grown up to be towering 30-foot trees. And so we have over time seen a change in kind of the habitats that are associated in those areas. And that's some of the change that we just continue to work with. As nature changes the area, we're changing our practices, perhaps our plant selections for some of those areas. They're fascinating. I mean, there's just always a question every day. All of you know this from working with native plants or learning about them, not just the plants, but the garden itself. You may become just fascinated by different types of wasps or different types of frogs that may appear in the garden. So there's always a new question. I spend a lot of time working with my volunteers, really addressing questions and things that happen before us while we're working in the garden. So interesting. And that goes along with this last point that I'd like to make, which is something I'm sure you've all noticed too, growing community interest in this type of gardening, partly because it's sustainable, partly because it's climate smart, and partly just because it's so much fun, it's beautiful, and people realize that having native plants around us is an important way for us to steward the environment that we live in, play in, work in, and so on. So that's another place where Wild Ones always comes in to this ambassador role to keep people interested, keep people learning, and keep people joining us in stewarding these kinds of gardens. So tonight I want to give some, our garden is a demonstration garden, of course, for homeowners and others to be inspired of what can be done in the built environment with native plants. So I'm going to give you some examples and pictures of that kind of go through the seasons. It's still, this is just the perfect time of year to see plant pictures, I think, because we've seen so much gray and brown and white. We had all the weathers yesterday. Every single weather that's possible we had yesterday. So today it was nice. We had a bright sunny day. So I think we're starting to feel that we're going to see a much more spring coming up soon. So I'll share some of those pictures with you. And I want to touch on this idea of resilience with gardens. So I'm going to touch on rain gardens briefly. They're a very effective way, especially around our homes, to deal with watershed health, which is another important aspect of native landscapes. And then monitoring pollinators, I'm going to focus in on that. We're doing a lot of emphasis, of course, many people are doing a lot of emphasis now on gardening for pollinators with that awareness that has been growing for quite a few years now. And so monitoring pollinators is actually, I consider, an essential part of gardening for pollinators. And I'll describe some of the good results that we've seen with that, just in particular around our area, and especially in Wisconsin, but Illinois is involved as well. And then sustainable gardening tips. These will just be gardening practices that I like to recommend and emphasize that are, of course, suitable for native plant gardening in general, but also will be suitable for that kind of pollinator gardening or awareness of how wildlife will use your garden as well. So this is a picture right here of the native plant garden at the Arboretum, and it is just the area kind of set in the context. It's set in a context of the Curtis Prairie is to the south, which is to the left in this picture. The horticultural collection that we have, our extensive horticultural collection, about 35 acres, is adjacent to the north, which would be to the right, and above this area around the visitor center. So the area around the visitor center, you can see there has some paved paths. It is wheelchair accessible during all times of day when the Arboretum grounds are open, even if the visitor center is not open. So those slopes and everything are graded and paths are graded so that we are totally accessible. We are very much a learning space too. The garden is a learning space too. Our camps and our tours use the garden a lot while starting off on a tour, or especially for the younger children, having activities and things to discover and places to explore. So it's a very important educational space as well. We are also surrounded now, the Arboretum is surrounded by about 14 different neighborhoods of Madison, and literally surrounded. So we have connections between those human communities as well. And for our pollinators, like for example, the neighborhood that you can see there at the top of the picture, that's well within the distance that, say, a bumblebee could fly back and forth between our gardens here and the neighborhood. So the connections are all very important, both biological, social, and educational. So we do have this garden was designed by Daryl Morrison. He is a designer, landscape architect, well-known landscape architect, and he designed the garden and drew out the designs for most of the areas by hand. So this is just an example of one small area of the garden where he drew out the plans showing the traffic patterns, the paths. Some of those are paved, some of those are just turf, so they're mowed. The trees and shrubs, you can see a little bit larger circles. Those were either existing trees and shrubs or they were added and planted at the beginning of the garden time. For this area was planted between, for the most part, between the years of 2002 and 2005. So different areas were done at different times during this space. What I want you to just notice about it, because you can't read any of the fine print, is how the different colors of the design correspond to the different species. And down at the bottom is the list of species. So we aren't talking, this is a small building. It's kind of like representing a house that might appear. It's actually was a residence at one time. And so if that were your house, how would you plant around your house? And what he's showing there is that the south exposure has a completely different set of plants than the northern exposure of the building. And then there are some shrub areas, different plants growing understory of those, and then different plants out in the part at the bottom of the design. You'll see a set of plants. That's really part of that area is actually acting as a small rain garden or drain. The water drains downhill to it. And so those are just different species altogether. So this is, you might start with a design like this. You can see the design principles that he's using kind of overall from that drawing. He has a lot of curved lines. There's really no straight lines there except for the building itself. He's using ways to move, showing ways to move through the space. And then when you look at it from like a view like this, from just standing in the garden, you can see there's areas of shadow and light. There's areas of taller plants and shorter plants. There's a very naturalistic planting going on there. So it's different. These different features can be seen on the plan, but then they're also reflected in the view that you get when you say, come out of the visitor center and take a look at the garden. But you might not have a designer, a world-renowned designer to help work on the project. And you might just want to start smaller. I do often recommend that for people if they're just starting or if they're expanding, is just take a bite-sized project each time. It's less frustrating. It gives good success because you can really focus on what you're doing. And it's one of the reasons why that garden that I just mentioned to you, you think, well, that wouldn't take 3 years to plant, but we put in the trees and shrubs first. We were preparing the area. So preparation is important to get good success later. We were sourcing plants over time to get the plants that we needed for it. So we were able to do the planting, over a period of time, and then we're very pleased with how it turned out. But we might just want to start thinking about the site that we're planting in, be it a new site or an expanded site, or just enhancing a garden that we already have going, and think about some favorite plants that we could add. And so here, if we have the big we want a tall plant for the prairie garden, wide open, south facing slope, no shade in the area. We might pick our compass plant, which is shown here at the left. Nice dramatic blooms, tall blooms in the summer with big, huge leaves, dissected leaves that come up, of course, earlier in the spring at the ground level. Now we might have a semi-shaded or even sun and shade area, and we might want a small shrub, and this dwarf bush honeysuckle would be a good choice for that. You can see that a bumblebee is visiting it. That's an excellent nectar plant, blooms in this early summer, late spring, and it can grow over a range of light conditions. It's very it doesn't get out of control. It's a very, it's a rather short, maybe 3 feet tall at the most, arching stems. So it's a really nice choice for an edge area, or area where you want a little bit of height, but not too much. And then of course, something like the pale purple cone flower here in the lower right is just a beautiful plant. They look like they're wilting, but those are the way the petals should look when the plant is blooming. And it's when the wind is blowing, they kind of look like they're dancing. It's just wonderful. And the cone of the plant, those disc flowers in the center there, are the ones that are blooming and attracting insects. The ray flowers don't really have that same, each of those ray flowers doesn't have the pollen that the that the bees are looking for, but they do provide the whole package of attractive flowers. So they do, they're really very beautiful. And so as we think about what areas we have, this area, if you remember on that first slide, I showed you a big tree, and that big tree was an ash tree. And it was for many years, just a wonderful, kind of actually historically significant tree, but it wasn't, it's an ash tree. So we don't treat our trees at the Arboretum, our ash trees, we don't treat them with insecticide. So, I mean, and there may be one exception or two exceptions in the Hort Garden of very significant trees, but that tree succumbed to the emerald ash borer over a period of a couple of years. And so it was removed. And when it was removed, Daryl designed a new garden for the space. Without the tree there, the space was wide open, no shade to it. And he designed a short grass prairie, a dry prairie that would have grass, 5 native grasses, and then some scattered forbs that would be blooming at different times of year. And here you can see some of the design principles even within that grass matrix, because he has the beautiful, there's the silvery June grass, which blooms very early. It blooms in June. So it is in the foreground there. That's those silvery seed heads. So in the middle of the summer, when this picture was taken, middle to late summer, the silvery seed heads, the seeds are already off the June grass. That's what you're seeing in the foreground. And then this ribbon kind of through the area with the fluffy purple is the purple love grass. And that's a full sun loving grass, a clump grass. It doesn't ever get very tall. Maybe the leaves of it only get about maybe 5 or 6 inches tall, but it spreads out into like a foot wide as each clump is growing. Then in the summer, in August, it gets this very fluffy, the fluffy seed heads, the flowers, I mean, on the top. And then of course, those become the seed heads. So a plant that you wouldn't even see in the spring is now at this time of year showing just this beautiful design in the garden. There are other grasses here. You can see some little blue stem. There's some side oats and prairie dropseed, all of them actually visible in this photo. Kind of just have to keep looking for them. And then we have in blooming in the photo, you also see some butterfly milkweed doing kind of a second bloom in this case. Liatris, rough blazing star, another good one. There's mountain mint back there in the background, and some other forbs now not quite visible in this. So we're watching this garden right now because the prairie smoke and the pasque flower are our first ones that will be coming up and blooming in this garden. So to start the season off with some plants, and to mention prairie smoke again, a little bit later than this, it will be blooming. And these are just 2 species that are very early blooming plants. The prairie smoke and shooting star can be in the same habitat. Shooting star can extend into a more semi-shaded area as well as an open prairie. So, but the prairie smoke doesn't like the shade very much. So do grow that one in the in the open. They both have pendulous flowers, and by that I mean the flowers are hanging down when they're in bloom, full bloom, and they are both bumblebee pollinated. So the bumblebees come and grab the flowers they come underneath and grab the flowers from the bottom, and then are able to shake or buzz pollinate that plant. So they shake the flower, that releases pollen out of the anthers and onto the bee, and then the bee can groom that pollen and put it onto her corbicula. And this bee that you see in this picture, you can see some of the pollen coming down, but you can also see that she's already gathered a lot and it's on her corbicula. So that's how she carries it back to the nest to feed the young, because the pollen is what she's gathering to feed the young. In both cases of these two plants, once the flower has been pollinated, the flower goes from being pendulous to being upright. And in the case of prairie smoke, the styles of the flower extend, and that's what we see, those long wispy features there. Those are the styles extended. And at the base of those, of course, is the fruit, and that will be the wind dispersed seed mechanism for prairie smoke. And in shooting star, it just makes a little capsule. So there's no wind dispersal. It's just there's one capsule there in the center of that photo that's upright. And once it develops, it will just open on its seams and the seeds will just shake out of there. The shooting star has very persistent seed heads. So while the shooting star leaves themselves, after blooming, the leaves themselves will die back and the little bud for the following year will be all ready to go underground in, say, June. The seed heads will remain and they'll turn brown and they will remain persistent over the summer. So you can find this plant by those, even if you can't see its leaves as the summer, of course, as its ephemeral life cycle is ending. Prairie smoke leaves will remain all summer, and the plant will sucker a little bit, so it will continue to grow, and it's a rosette, so it kind of takes up space right on the ground level. Doesn't like a lot of shading over it, but it will spread and kind of with smaller plants, it will kind of like hold its own. And we've noticed that the deer really love it, so they've nibbled it down now, but they're starting to leave it alone or maybe find other food now. So the plants are also starting to grow faster. So the rosettes will be starting to form the flowering stalks soon. The mesic prairie garden. So everyone probably is familiar with the term mesic, but just in case, mesic is describes medium moisture. So we have dry and wet, and mesic would be right in the middle. So we can have those intermediate like dry mesic or wet mesic, but mesic just means medium or middle. And it's a good choice for average soil, plants that like mesic soil situations are a good choice for most situations, because unless you have very, very dry sand or very, very heavy and wet clay, you're going to you'll probably be somewhere in the middle, and these are good plants to use. This is a mesic prairie garden that is in full sun, and this picture was taken in May probably. So we have the spiderwort is the purple kind of blooming throughout the morning every day. And then in this picture, we can see a lot of texture. We can see the tall grasses that are, of course, not blooming in May. We can see some grass that is blooming, and that would be the blue joint grass, a little bit of that in this garden. There's heuchera blooming, or alum root, in the foreground. And then the yellow is just the beginnings of the oxeye, or the early sunflower blooming. And there's a lot of that in this garden as well. It seeds very effectively. So here we see, what catches our eye right now, and obviously in most gardens, is what's blooming at the time. And so here we can see kind of the progress of the season if we keep watching what's blooming. And a lot of different forms of plants here, a lot of texture, and a lot of change coming in the whole season. Here we have the spiderwort again. So this picture is taken about that same time of year. We're going to kind of move through the year with these photos. And this is an understory of the black oak savanna, kind of at the edge of the savanna. So these plants like sunlight, but they can tolerate a bit of shade, or they even like a little bit of shade. And then we have the downy wood mint, and that has proven to be a very, very good plant to include at this time of year, because early in the season, we're not seeing in the open areas, we're not seeing a lot of mints blooming, perhaps after the creeping Charlie is done blooming. But this is a mint, and it's very attractive to a lot of insects, but particularly for our bees. They really enjoy that plant. The spiderwort, this picture was probably taken in the morning, because there's the spiderwort in full bloom. It hasn't begun to, the petals haven't begun to deliquesce and kind of crumple down. Each of those spiderwort flowers only lasts for one day. So each day there's a new set of flowers. And if you take a close look at these buds, you can see there's a lot of buds that are still to bloom and a lot of buds that have already bloomed. So this will be blooming over weeks' time. And of course, it's shedding the seeds at that same time. So if you want to collect seeds from spiderwort, you can put a little, like a little netting over them, put a twist tie around underneath, and they will, then you'll capture some of the seeds that were produced earlier before, and you might cut back on pollination or seed production of the latest ones, but at least you'll catch some of them. Otherwise, they're going to all be down in the garden and you won't be able to collect them if you want to. And another area of understory or semi-shade, these are some plants for that. The wild columbine, which is a short-lived perennial, but it does very well seeding itself where there's disturbance. So in an established garden, you'll find it in the edges, or maybe in the middle if there was some kind of other disturbance, maybe a woodchuck or something like that. But it loves a disturbance. So you can create disturbance and get it to seed more if you have some of it already growing there. Again, it has those little capsules, kind of similar to the shooting star in terms of their shape, and you can just shake out the seeds and scatter them in any open soil. There's the golden Alexanders. That's another one that spreads by seed prolifically, but it's not a tall plant. It blooms very early. As you can see here, these are very early blooming plants. So it's nice to have some nice blooms early in especially in the more open areas. And then the wild geranium, of course, which spreads mostly rhizomatously, but it does attract a lot of pollinators, including, because of these masses of flowers, including some specialist bees. And here are some more of those very early spring plants. We're just waiting and looking for them, for signs of them coming up soon. The spring beauty, very diminutive plant, but it seeds itself effectively. It actually likes disturbance, so it'll seed itself into a path, a footpath or something like that. It's a small plant, so it does need, it may get overpowered by other plants if if it's getting crowded in, but that's one of the reasons why I think it likes the disturbed areas that are more open. It's an ephemeral, so you see it when it's blooming, it sets its seed, and then it dies back early on in the season before the tree canopy closes, but it's all ready for next year already by the time that happens. Jacob's Ladder is a summer green species, so that will be there. You'll see the leaves all year, but wonderful clusters of flowers, and it has a good range of open or semi-shaded habitats. And they will work most of our yards have the kind of shade that these plants would work well in if you have trees. Wild geranium and woodland phlox is another species that's showing in this photo. Again, woodland phlox is a rhizomatous species. The deer in our garden, the deer like it a lot, so they nibble it down sometimes, but you can put some stakes and put crisscrossing like like not big rope, but like, you know, string basically, and they don't like walking around and stuff like that. So it's not very obtrusive, and it will, they won't like that. They won't like walking in there. And then the understory of the maple basswood. So this is the deepest shade that we have, and plants like the wild ginger is a nice ground cover in that situation. And of course, other plants can grow with it. Here you can see some maidenhair ferns are coming up through the ginger. And ginger is so interesting because it does spread rhizomatously. Of course, it can just move along the ground. Its stem is basically right along the ground or just under the ground. And then its flowers are also right on the ground, and they are both pollinated and dispersed by ants and beetles. So you'll find seedlings of you can find seedlings of wild ginger like far away from where it's actually growing. And if you can recognize them, then you can, if they're out in the open, you could rescue them and bring them back to the shade. But sometimes they will grow in sunnier areas than you expect. But it's a wonderful ground cover. It blooms, it's summer green, so the leaves will be there. It's not an ephemeral, but the flowers are red and they are right on the ground. And then we have 12 species of native milkweed. I like to put this slide kind of in the middle because there is a milkweed for almost every situation. Some of the native species we will not be growing in our gardens simply because they're either so rare or so difficult to get a hold of, difficult to propagate, that they just aren't available. But there are a number that are available and suitable for the different situations that we would have in our home gardens or community gardens. So we have the butterfly weed. Here on the left, it's growing with the white sage, and you might notice it has this particular one has kind of a reddish color to it. It might be coral, it might be just that bright orange. It has to do with how much red pigment is in the plant, because we've actually found butterfly milkweed that lacked the red pigment, so the flowers are kind of a golden yellow, but it's the same plant. So the amount of red pigment is determining how much, kind of what that orange or orange red color is. Very interesting situation. And that you look at the flower structure of milkweed. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but you see it's very, the structure of the flowers is very consistent from species to species, even though the color, the shape, the habitat can be completely different. So here's the little whorled milkweed. This is a shorter little milkweed. Butterfly milkweed is just spreads by seed. It doesn't spread rhizomatously or with underground stems, but whorled milkweed is rhizomatous. So because it's so short and because it doesn't crowd out anything that it's moving and growing within or among, it is a very, kind of a delicate little plant, and it really is a good neighbor to other plants. It's not going to like overpower them. So it blooms much later in the summer. It blooms in like August, and it's more suited for drier sites. So if I were to choose, these are both suitable for dry or dry mesic sites. But if I were to choose one for a very dry site, I would choose the whorled milkweed or try that one for sure. And moving along into the season, we have in the wet mesic prairie garden. So this is an area that gets moisture across it from our roof and our drainage, the way the drainage is designed through the garden. But you can see here in midsummer, we have the prairie blazing star. This is the columns there, and they bloom starting at the top because each of those tufts on the stalk is a head. So it starts at the top and blooms down. They aren't individual flowers, except within each head. And then the Culver's root is the white one, and that one's individual flowers along the stalk. So it starts at the bottom and blooms upward as it continues its bloom. And then looks like a little bit of Joe Pye weed there and a little bit of prairie phlox in the foreground. You can see from this picture that there are plants that have already bloomed by the time this picture was taken. So the irises had already bloomed, the blue joint grass had already bloomed. And then there are plants that haven't bloomed yet. So we see their texture more, not the flowers yet, but that in the center there, you can see a drift of grass leaf goldenrod, kind of starting to get a little yellow on top. So that kind of sequence of blooming is always present in these diverse gardens. That rain garden, our big rain garden in the summer, it looks like this. We have the sweet black-eyed Susan, things that we can recognize from here. We see some Joe Pye weed. We see some Culver's root, and then in the distance we see some beyond the rain garden, we can see some of the sweet Indian plantain. This is just a tall garden. It gets all the drainage from half of the roof, more than what you can see in this photo, that comes into this basin, and it works very effectively. We've had some extremely heavy rainfalls that were in a really short period of time. Last summer, we had over 4.5 inches of rain in 1 hour. And this garden just filled up with water. And then it was midsummer, and then it just infiltrated very effectively over the next couple of days. One of the plants that's growing in this garden is our bottle gentian. The blue bottle gentian is a flower that does not open any more than what you're seeing here. And the ones with the white tips are the ones that are in full bloom. The others have already been pollinated, the darker ones, the purple tipped ones. And those petals are held tight like that because they are 5 petals fused together in a ring, and then they're pleated and fold in kind of automatically to close the bottle. And a bumblebee has to come to the tip of that flower and open those pleats up and get in there, rumble around inside for a while, and gather its pollen, and then pop back out. And the petals just close back around, either around the bee when it's in, or when the bee leaves, they just close back around. And then inside, the capsule is developing. And if you have a chance sometime to see this plant, if you see those capsules, once the flowers have matured, the fruits have matured, they are about the size, about 1 inch long or so, and they are just a little bit thick. They're pretty thick, not quite as thick as the bottle, but almost. And they are filled with tiny, tiny, tiny seeds. So those seeds are spread by wind, and they're spread by water. And so this is a good, very good plant to have, or grows naturally in wetland areas or near wetlands, and likes that wet mesic condition. And then, of course, the end of the season, we have all our warm season grasses, the beautiful tall grasses like big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass. And then we have our short grasses, warm season grasses like the little blue stem, which turns this beautiful red, kind of red coppery color. So those are just wonderful end of the season color and end of the season blooms. And then, of course, it's a time of very dramatic seed dispersal. And nope. Seed dispersal. So here is just an example of common milkweed. But of course, many of the species are dispersing seeds or ready to disperse seeds at that time. And it's a time when we're collecting seeds a lot. So if you've done a lot of native seed collecting, you know that you really see a lot of those toward the end of the summer. The species, the way the species are blooming, the way the maturity happens, the end of the summer, early fall is a time when we can really take advantage of collecting a lot of seed. And it's aster and goldenrod season. What can I say? There's so many species of each of them. There's some for every garden situation, shade, sun, and they are so valuable. They are really the end of the season nutritional value for everything that's going either into winter dormancy or finishing up its life cycle, or like say in the case of monarchs, they're migrating, and other butterflies that migrate longer distances. So this is just the most, there's so many species and so many to grow and so many to take us to the very end of the season when these plants have been used by those kinds of insects. So I want to touch on rain gardens a bit. This is our wet mesic prairie garden that leads to the rain garden. And here, a little bit later in the season than I shared a moment ago, we have the prairie blazing star still blooming, but we see now mountain mint. We see the seed heads really of the St. John's wort we have in that garden. There are there's a little bit of Monarda in the garden, a lot of Monarda in the garden across the lawn there. So, and the yellow is the sweet black-eyed Susan that I mentioned already. So the idea of a rain garden is really to improve watershed health on the scale that we can do that with our yards and our community gardens. So we are looking for places where we can grow native plants. The native plants can actually penetrate over time, not too many years. They can penetrate heavier soils with the growth of their roots. The roots are extensive in the soil, but they're always dynamic. There are roots that are growing, there's roots that are dying at all times. So those are creating little channels, creating a more organic matter in the soil, which then can hold more moisture and infiltrate water in place. The garden that I'm showing you right here was on the heaviest clay that I could ever imagine planting plants into, and initially. And over time has become a different, it's become a different type of area. We now have more infiltration going on there. We have establishment of more species going on there. And it's really quite remarkable. The rain garden itself, of course, has plants that do well with much moisture toward the bottom of the basin and then on up the slopes. But of course, we've had serious droughts when that area is completely dry for periods of time. And in the case, depending on the timing of the drought, you'd have, say the drought starts early in the season. You have the plants that would normally be doing well with a lot of moisture, you have them not doing well. So now there are gaps. And one year we had such a severe drought early in the season that when I looked at the rain garden later, I noticed there were 5 species of native annual plants that were filling in all the space that was left by the perennials not being able to thrive as they usually did. So quite remarkable. Just that one year, I'm sure they dropped their seeds. And if that happens again, we'll probably see them again. But it's just an example of how, and then the following year with more rain or with excessive rain, everything looked like it had, prior to that drought year. So the resilience even of a rain garden, even of plants that like water in drought, can be quite remarkable. And so we know that the plants can make it through those kinds of conditions. This is our little rain garden. We have a small one in front, and this was at its initial planting. So you can see that it was kind of bare everywhere there before we planted. And this is just a small basin. The plants are quite a variety. You can see the flags there were marking different places where there's drainage and we didn't want to plant close to the rock wall, but otherwise it's filled in with plants, and you can see the different types, different forms. And then a couple of years later, the upper picture there shows you the result. We have the Angelica there at the right. That's a early season plant in the Apiaceae or the carrot family. So you can see those big seed heads, those big round brown seed heads are the mature seeds. It's a biennial. So these plants that you're seeing here were the second year plants. And the first year plants is just a rosette at the ground, and at the center there is one. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but just large leaves that coming out of one point at the ground. And then the second year is when it puts up this big stalk. Here we have some, the reason I want to show this picture again is that, or at this point, is that we have those red flowers in the back there. Those are the red milkweed, rose milkweed, swamp milkweed. It's known by a lot of names. And then the close-up is of that plant. So there's that typical structure of the milkweed flower with the those reflexed petals there at the base, and then the interesting, very unique form of the flower that you can see on top. And there are 5 parts to the flower. And in between each of those little, what they're called horns on the flower, there is a little structure in the center, around that center part, that has a branch, a kind of a forked design with 2 little pollen pouches attached and a little connector at the top. And that the story of pollinating milkweed is kind of interesting, because we are so used to thinking of the very tight and close relationship that monarch butterflies have with milkweed, which is really a feeding and nectaring relationship, and not so much a pollination relationship. So monarchs are not a primary pollinator of milkweed. They depend on it entirely, and milkweed is propagated by seed. In other words, when we're looking to plant more areas of milkweed, we either need to get seeds to propagate more plants, to produce them get them in production, so that there's lots of plants for people to buy and people to use for planting. Or we need to use a seed and scatter it in areas where it would be suitable for milkweed to grow, because monarchs do depend on that. We all know, are familiar now with the recent news about the proposed listing for monarchs. The comment period apparently has been reopened. So if you didn't get a chance to comment your support for that listing, you could always do that. Now it'll be 2 more months to that. So you could visit Monarch Joint Venture for more information about where to go, what the links are for that. But this is a monarch laying her eggs on milkweed. Of course, it's essential for the caterpillars. It's their only food that they would have. But what about the pollination? Turns out that because of that structure on the flower, very unique, that larger insects, heavier insects, and stronger insects like bumblebees and like large wasps are the primary pollinators of milkweed. So the monarch is in this way depending on the bees to pollinate the plant that it requires. And that just gives us a sort of simple example of very important relationships. And so here on the bumblebee that's pictured, you can see some of golden structures from its legs and at its mandible even. And those are those pollen packets that I described. This bee pulled those out, not intentionally, just because of the hooks on their legs, pull those out, and then will visit, when it visits another milkweed, those little packets have to slip into a little slot on the flower in order to pollinate that plant. So just think about those different relationships. Of course, you're pretty familiar, I'm sure, with different webs and interconnections between animals and plants in your garden. So getting on to the last section, I would like to go over these garden kind of guidelines and tips. And so here we would want to maximize the number and diversity of native plants in the landscape. This means just the sheer number of plants. So my saying is there's always room for one more native plant, and you can slip it in somewhere. And there's usually room for another kind of native plant. How do we know what, say we have an area that looks like this now. Well, what plants could we add to that? What plants would be appropriate? What plants would do well? If we know native plants that are growing well in an area, we can use resources such as the Flora of the Chicago Region, that big book, and look up the plants that are doing well in our garden and look at what their associates would be. What plants do they grow with in nature that we could also add? And that book, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but when I finish the talk, I'll have a link for you on the last slide, and that will be a reference list. So you can go to that link and you'll see the Flora of the Chicago Region, and you'll be able to look at that. It's a huge book, so maybe encouraging your library to get that book as a reference book, because you wouldn't use it every day. You would probably use it, once or twice a year. If you are stuck and you can't find a copy of it, or you're just wondering for one plant, what is it? Just, you can email me and I will look it up for you and give you some suggestions from that. So, of course, this is just standard gardening advice to get the right plant in the right place. I just want to emphasize that matching doesn't mean there's like a narrow one-to-one kind of relationship here. We want to think about the site conditions. We want to think about the variability in those site conditions, even in a small space. And then we'll do some trial. We'll try things as we always do with, well, let's try it here along this gradient of light or along this gradient of moisture and see what works well. And here we can see on the left-hand side, that's the north side of our visitor center. And I have a lot of spring ephemerals growing along there. There's not really, you can see there's just one tree there. It's not particularly shady, but it is a microclimate because of the building, the north side of the building, slightly shadier, slightly cooler, and slightly more moist than areas just say 10 feet away from that building. And the ephemerals do well along the building. And then where they showed up in the plan on the other side of the path that you can see there, they don't do well at all. They can sometimes hang, some of the species can hang in there, but it's very hard for them. So in this case, we're using that little, or we've had the advantage of that little microclimate. And our gardens often have these kinds of microclimates that we can take advantage of. The rain garden I mentioned before, when we have a drought, as you can see here, the Joe Pye weed in this picture is either it's in a wilt condition, of course, so maybe that was late in the afternoon, but this was also during a time when that garden had not had much rain. We had not had it wasn't a serious drought, but it wasn't a good, consistent rain over a period of time. But those plants are just fine. Even if they're suffering for a while here, we don't water them. They will recover. They're blooming. They will set seed. And the next year you wouldn't notice any difference whatsoever. They might even have a larger grouping of them the following year. So be thinking about sun, of course, soil type, moisture type, and this little microclimate or, topography differences like a rain garden where you've got a little bit more moisture in one area, but close by a little less. And then this is kind of a slide that I like to bring up about, again, emphasizing the pollinators, because we have so many pollinators active in our gardens. These are two that are, the one on the left there is a cellophane bee. These will be active. You can see they're on a Durca flower. So that flower has the stamens sticking out of the flower as it starts to bloom. The blooms are on bare stems because they come out before the leaves do. So this is a very accessible flower. Bees can collect pollen off of that readily. But the indigo here, the member of the pea family, has a much more complicated structure, and the bee, in this case a leafcutter bee, has to kind of muscle the flower open, spring the stamens up so that they can be accessed. And a tiny little bee couldn't do that, but a larger bee could. So we want to include not only a seasonal sequence of blooms, but these different flower forms, and kind of get as much diversity in that as we possibly can. And it kind of comes naturally with thinking about, well, what would be a suite of prairie plants that we could grow? And as we think about that list and keep expanding it, we know that we'll have different flower forms included in that. And that rain garden that I mentioned, the big one, just to show you that in the middle of the summer, that would be that half of the garden is showing there on the left, and then the other half showing at the very end of the season. So here we have the showy goldenrod, the New England aster, and there's some Riddell's goldenrod. They're still in bloom. These are the very last flowers to be blooming in the whole garden. So that's the very end of the season. We've got the shoulder season covered there, as well as the mid-season where you can see a lot of variety. And then this idea, which has been developed by Wild Ones and by Heather Holm, and it's based in a lot of Doug Tallamy's work. So this idea of soft landings when we are working on our gardens and we have a large tree, we can think of the drip line of that tree as a garden bed. And the soft landings idea is a lot of our Lepidoptera, after they've fed and their caterpillars growing up in the canopy of the tree, they many of them will then go into their wandering stage, which is walk down and get into the ground and bury themselves. Like they'll dig a chamber underground, or they may just be in leaf litter, or they may use leaves themselves to create their shelter for their dormant pupal stage. And if we have these beds underneath the tree instead of like lawn mowed up to the tree trunk, then we're creating that kind of space where those life cycles can continue, and we won't be losing those individuals as they are part of the system. They are not every caterpillar. In fact, most caterpillars don't make it to adulthood. Most caterpillars make it into being bird food. So these are the insects that we want to keep, not just for their own sake and their own diversity, but to also keep those populations healthy so that the animals that depend on them for food will also be healthy. So the idea here is you just keep the leaves under there. You don't have to mow it. You don't mulch it. You don't have to put landscape fabric or anything. You might want to put a little fence just to kind of keep it set off. But these are some very helpful places for overwintering or for just that dormant period. And certain trees, of course, are really the most valuable they host the most species of Lepidoptera on them. So those would be key ones to try this approach with, like oak, willow, cherry, and birch as good examples. Of course, if we're planting under there, if you're planting wildflowers or something, you don't want to damage the tree roots. So we just kind of do that delicately around as we work by hand around the base of the tree. Of course, I recommend that we plant species native to the area, and that means, broadly speaking, either plants that are, in our immediate area or not too far in latitude. Many people are asking now, well, shouldn't we be planting southern species in order to account for climate change? And my thought on that is to really stick with the species of our region. The plants are moving and changing, and some of the insect species, of course, are doing, have different patterns now of geographic patterns. But I think overall, since we know that the native plants of our area do have that, they're somewhat adaptable. If we start to try to use plants from vastly different areas, like much further south, what will we choose? There's ideas that maybe our area will become more like Nebraska or more like Arkansas in the future. And so if we're guessing of which plants we should bring, I think we're better off with thinking about the plants that are adapted here. Plants that are close, near neighbors are probably getting here anyway. And that's the change that we'll see. Obviously, keeping track of successes will be important too. And that's where our monitoring, either plants, insects, etc., comes in as kind of an integral part of gardening. Emphasizing plants that are known to promote pollinators. If you're interested in pollinator gardening, here's like a list for the rusty patch bumblebee, which is an endangered species. At the federal level, these references listed at the bottom there will be available on your reference list that I'll provide. We want to avoid pesticides. I find that they're not really necessary. We don't see insect damage other than the kind of normal feeding that that you would expect a few holes in the leaves on an oak tree or something like that is not a huge deal. If we do have beneficial insects and we do have birds, healthy populations of them, then we're going to see that they're keeping, they're keeping some of the, the other trophic levels under control. The systemic insecticides are a problem. Probably most of you are familiar with this because when they're used in plant production, so say in a nursery where they're planting out seedlings and then growing them up for us to purchase for our plant sale or for our garden, those plants in production, if they've been treated with a systemic insecticide, say as a soil drench, they will have the insecticide within their tissue, in their stem, in the leaves, in the flowers, in the nectar, in the pollen. And that can be very detrimental. We know to be very detrimental to the insects that are gathering the pollen to feed their young, feeding on nectar to nourish themselves. And that goes not just for, the pollen that's affected would affect bees and their larvae, but many insects are drinking the nectar too, and so it affects a wide population of flower visiting insects. So that is a problem for that will be a problem for our insects. So make sure that your nursery plants have not been pre-treated with systemic insecticides. We want to keep a little rough area around there. This looks like a good bumblebee nesting area right here, in my opinion. So we keep a kind of a rough area for us to for some of these natural processes, life cycles, overwintering, nesting areas to exist. We leave the plant material standing over the winter. And so now at this point, we're in areas that we can't use prescribed fire. You're just trimming the stems down a bit. And those stems can be used by insects this year that are using hollow stems.
Excuse me, Susan. This is Janet. We're going to have to wrap it up because we have to be out of the library by 8 o'clock.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. That's
all right. Let me get to the last slide so people can get the references. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
There it is. Can you see that red link there?
Yes.
The red link is the reference list. So you can go to that link and you should be able to pull that up. If you have any problems, simply